Hi, this is Paul Maggio from the Kenosha Regenerator Producers Watershed Group. I'm here today to introduce Jamie Patton from the NRCS. Jamie is going to demonstrate our Rainfall Simulator. And no matter what your experience is, you've been farming your whole life or you're new, if you're a landowner or a homeowner, I think this will be eye-opening to you to how the various farming practices affect water quality and our water cycle. So please enjoy. And if you'd like more information, you can contact Kenosha Regenerator Producers Watershed Group. We have a website under that name. Please feel free to reach out to us.
Hi, I'm Jamie Patton with the NRCS. What we're looking at today is the Rainfall Simulator. What this apparatus does is it gives us an idea of the runoff and infiltration under different land management systems. So I want to go through some of the land management practices we have today. So first off, what we're going to be seeing is a prairie. So this is a restored prairie. It's been a prairie for about 10 years now. So lots of vegetation, good root growth. Next to that, we have managed grazing. So what that means is that this is a pasture. So we have beef cattle running across the land, but it's managed, meaning that it's rotationally grazed. So the cattle only have access to this parcel of land every so often, and they will rotate throughout that pasture, giving this vegetation, the alfalfa that you see, a rest period. So we graze it down to a certain point, and then we take the animals off, and then we allow it to regenerate itself. Next to that, we have a tilled field that has cover crops. So this is under vegetable production. So it was tilled this year. We took a vegetable crop off. And then after that, we planted this multi-species cover crop, and that's what we see on the tray right now. We also have a tilled silage field. So this is corn silage this year. It was tilled prior to that silage being planted, and that silage was just recently harvested. And then we have a managed lawn, just to give us an idea of how our own lawns stack up against some of these agricultural practices. So what we're going to be doing next is we're going to turn on the water and we're going to allow this rainfall simulator to rain. And what we're looking at and what we should be watching as this rainfall simulator works is how much rain we get on the land surface. The front buckets simulate what would be running off that land management system. So if we are getting runoff, does it have soil in it, or is it clear? And the back buckets are letting us visualize how much water is infiltrating into that soil. So we'll let this rainfall run for about an inch, and then we will turn it off and examine the buckets. In that short period of time, we received just over a half an inch of rain. I'm going to take these infiltration buckets and I'm going to sit them right in front so that we can compare these different land managements. So as you can see, some of them have lots of water that have infiltrated into these systems, and some of them have very little. And we'll talk about why that is. So let's look at these top buckets here. This is simulating runoff. And what I want you to notice is when we look at those fields that have been tilled, we notice that these buckets are very dirty and there's a lot of water in them, meaning that under these land management systems, under this very intense rainfall that we just had, we're seeing that not only is water running off the landscape, but soil and nutrients as well. Where does that soil and nutrient end up? Sometimes it ends up at different locations in our field. Sometimes it ends up in rivers and streams and lakes that can cause sediment pollution as well as nutrient pollution. So you'll notice that in both of these systems that were tilled, we see more runoff than in systems that have been managed under perennial vegetation, such as managed grazing and prairie. What I mean by perennial vegetation is that these plants have been growing for a significant period of time. Not just 1 year, but probably 3, 4, in this instance about 10 years, in this instance I think about 5 years. So we haven't tilled up the soil, the roots have interacted with those soil particles, they've created soil aggregates, and what soil aggregates are little balls of soil. So when you dig into the soil, as you pick it up, you'll notice that it crumbles into certain sizes and certain shapes. It should fall into your hands like chocolate cake crumbs, like cookie crumbs, like cottage cheese, right? We like to use food to describe how soil should look. So if we pick up soil and we see all of those nice little spheres, what that means is that they can't pack very well together. And when they can't pack very well together, we get all of this pore space. That pore space allows water to move into the system, and therefore it gets stored in the soil or it moves down even further, recharging the subsoil. So it's all about that better structure, allowing water to move into the soil to be stored or to be filtered as it moves down into the groundwater system. How do we get that nice cookie crumb granular structure? We get that through reducing disturbance. So not tilling the soil, not disrupting that soil, not driving or trafficking over the top of that soil all that often. We also get that, more importantly, through root growth. And when we look at root growth, those roots not only help to bring those soil particles together, but those roots help to invite in the soil biology that further enmesh and bring those soil particles together, but also glue them together to create that beautiful round structure that allows water to infiltrate. So when we look at these systems that have that perennial vegetation, we have that lack of disturbance, we have that perennial root, we have that cover that helps to protect the soil against raindrop impact. When a raindrop comes down and it hits this grass, that energy is dissipated or released into that vegetation. Therefore, it's allowed to move slowly into the soil and soak in. It doesn't bust those soil particles apart. It doesn't throw them up in the air, because as soon as they're thrown up into the air, as we see in these systems, we tend to get runoff and we tend to get erosion. What most people are oftentimes pretty shocked at is we didn't get any runoff out of that, hardly at all, out of that prairie. You'll notice what did come off is very, very clear. And the same thing with our managed grazing. In this little bit of a half-inch rainfall, you'll notice both of these, the prairie on my left hand and the managed grazing on my right. You'll notice there's very little water in these buckets, right? And it's very clear. You'll also notice in this managed grazing, in this prairie, there's very little water as compared to the other, actually, that infiltrated. And this is a really important concept. So people think, oh my gosh, right? That water did not infiltrate into the soil. And it did, but it just didn't flow down through the pan, right? Because it was being stored. So when we look at this prairie, which has been under perennial vegetation for almost a decade, what we're seeing is the roots and the microorganisms have died back and have increased the soil organic matter content of that soil. That soil organic matter acts as a sponge and is able to hold water. So when we look at this prairie and we look at this managed grazing, right, what's happening is water isn't running off. It is all soaking, almost all soaking in or being stored in the above ground vegetation and allowed to slowly infiltrate in the soil, but it's then being stored in that soil. And that's a really important concept for years like this year, where in the state of Wisconsin, we're undergoing a drought. So every drop of water that I can get to move into the soil and be stored in the soil is very, very important. It allows for that root growth, it allows for that plant growth, it allows that productivity to continue for these different systems.
So as you can imagine, if there's a rain event, the water will try to move to a lower spot at the farm. And there are these gullies that were carved out previously when there was conventional tillage here, where all this water was trying to find a low spot where it could go, and it carved its way through here. And since we put it into perennial agriculture, we don't have a runoff problem. It all gets captured.
So when we look at managed grazing and prairies, both these perennial systems, we'll notice from a water quality aspect, both are very, very good, right? They're reducing the amount of runoff that's coming off the field, and the water that does run off is very clear. And you'll notice we do get infiltration, so water is definitely moving in the soil. It's starting to recharge that subsoil moisture, but more importantly, it's being stored in that soil. In the two tilled systems, you'll notice in the one that's tilled with silage and the one with cover crop, you'll notice we get more runoff, and that runoff is dirtier. There's more sediment running off these fields. You'll notice we do get infiltration, so that is good, right? We like to see that water moving into the soil. Caveat, everybody's like, oh no, right? The cover crop field didn't do as well as I would expect. Realize as we switch over to soil health management systems from a tilled system, that improvement in soil health and improvement in soil function takes time. This is only, I believe, the second year that this field has been cover cropped. And so we're starting to see that aggregation, that cookie crumb structure, that chocolate cake structure starting to be reformed. And we're starting to see that soil heal itself over time. And you'll notice that by the amount of runoff that's coming off of those two soils, right? There's less runoff coming off of the one that does have cover crop. That cover crop is helping to armor the soil, again, protect it from that raindrop impact. It's also helping to create that soil aggregation, that soil health that allows water not only to move into the soil, but also be stored in the soil. So you'll notice there is a difference in runoff between the tilled versus the cover crop field. As this cover crop field matures and as we continue on our soil health journey, we'll start to see this field move more towards the managed grazing type situation where that soil health has improved to a point where we've reduced runoff, we've increased storage, and we've reduced the amount of sediment leaving that field. You'll notice in our grass field, right, we do get some runoff. I always point this out, particularly for our own homeowners. So we do get runoff even with this grass. So when we look at this soil, it is well covered, but we are getting runoff, and that runoff has a lot of sediment in it. So even when we think about our own homes, we can apply the same soil health practices and principles to help us reduce runoff and erosion and improve soil health. So when we look at these systems, again, it helps us to identify how our management can impact runoff, water quality, and erosion. So this rainfall simulator is a great example of those 4 soil health principles that we like to talk about. One is minimize disturbance. So you'll notice those fields that are tilled tend to have more erosion and runoff than those that have not been tilled in the recent past. So those that are under permanent vegetation perform better in the runoff category versus those that have some cover or no cover but have had that disturbance in the recent past. Our other soil health principles are maximize roots. So again, you'll notice all of those systems that had some sort of root in them, particularly the managed grazing in the prairie, did a very good job of helping to get that water to move into the ground and to infiltrate as well as to store it on the landscape. Other soil health principle is to maximize diversity. So you'll notice these 3 systems, in fact, all have diversity, right? So we have diverse plants. In this one, in the managed grazing, we have alfalfa, we have grasses. The prairie, if you could get in here, you'd see all sorts of different prairie plants. So as we use that diversity, it stimulates diverse microorganisms. It gets different root architectures out there in the soil system. And maybe more importantly, particularly in stressful years such as this one where we've had a lack of water, when we have these diverse systems, what we do is we ensure that some plant is going to be growing, right? So each plant has a certain niche, some like this soil, some like that soil, some like this moisture content, some like this soil chemistry. So when we plant diverse mixtures, we can ensure that we get that type of plant coverage that we need to cover the soil and reduce runoff and erosion.
One of the things that Jamie talked about too is when we take animals, we put them on a spot, we use the electric fencing to keep them out of certain areas. So the grass gets rest here. So now this grass maybe was grazed a month ago. It's resting. No animals can come back on it, so it can grow back and continue to have a strong plant and root system and still be able to produce. So it's really about resting the plants and not having animals come back here and continuously graze it, which the animals are only going to select what they like. And what they don't like is going to propagate here, which are usually our weed species and things that aren't so desirable. So if we can still protect our grasses and legumes by, having the animals stay off it and rest, we can come back here again and they can graze again and we give it rest. So that's the cycle that happens here. And that probably was done, thousands of years ago with the buffalo and the Great Plains that built that really, beautiful soil there as they would migrate. So they would eat the grass and they'd move to another area, and that grass would get like a year to grow back and to put carbon through its root system into the soil and build those deep, rich soils. But the buffaloes wouldn't stay there; they would continue to migrate to eat new grasses and new grasses.
So that maximize diversity is out there. And of course, my favorite, if I had to have a favorite soil health principle, is maximize roots. As we talked about earlier, those roots are what are helping us to create that soil aggregation, create that pore space, and allow that soil to function. And so wherever we have living roots, we see better performance on the runoff and infiltration, and in particularly where we have that perennial vegetation. Lastly, as we wrap up the rainfall simulator, I want us to remember those 4 soil health principles: minimize disturbance, maximize roots, maximize cover, and maximize diversity. But more important, thinking about how we as individuals, whether we be farmers or whether we just simply be homeowners, how we can change our land management practices to impact runoff and erosion is an important concept to take home.